Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We will get started in just another minute or so. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We will get started in just another minute. Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Sam Gordon, and I am a member of the board of the Central New York chapter of the Upstate chapter of the American Planning Association. I want to welcome you all here. I want to stress to everyone that the issue of climate change is an issue that the American Planning Association is committed to addressing in our communities, and also addressing the equity and other issues that climate change is going to have on our communities. In fact, the Upstate chapter did submit already some comments to the CLCPA on March 31st of last year. So we're ahead of the game. As many of you may know, New York State enacted the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in 2019. And it set some aggressive targets, including an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and a net zero economy by 2050. Very ambitious goals. And the New York State Climate Action Council, which has been responsible for developing a scoping plan to achieve those reductions, has released that draft, and the comment period on the draft ends June 10th. So in advance of that, we've invited Mark Lowry, who is the Assistant Director of the Office of Climate Change for New York State, to be here with us this morning and present on this timely and important topic. Before I introduce Mark, I do want to say he has requested that we hold our questions till the end. So if you can use the Q&A function to ask any questions that you have while he's speaking, and then what we'll do is go through those at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mark Lowry. Mark, thank you for being with us this morning. Mark is a 34-year veteran of the New York State DEC. And as I said, he is the Assistant Director of the Office of Climate Change. He has led many different public outreach efforts on behalf of the state, including support of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, state-supported efforts to look at sea level rise, and as well as climate action planning across the state. He has also led the implementation of the Community Risk and Resiliency Act, and that particular work included developing regulations to adopt official state sea level rise projections, which have served as guidance documents related to flood risk education across the state. Mark currently leads the state's interagency climate adaptation resilience working group, and several other work groups focused on adaptation to the effects of climate change across the state. He has been a member of the Climate Action Council's Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel, and has led the development of the Council's adaptation and resilience recommendations. Mark holds a bachelor's degree in biology from Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, PA, and a master's degree in environmental and forest biology from the State College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Mark. Thanks for being with us, Mark.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for helping to organize this event. We have been talking to a large number of groups, lay groups, different professional groups, different stakeholder groups, trying to get the word out about this draft scoping plan. I do want to set expectations. People should not expect that I'm going to provide all the details that are in this 342-page plan, plus the 500 pages of appendices that are attached to the plan itself, and the literally thousands of pages of supporting documentation. All that is available at the website climate.ny.gov, which I will mention several times over the next 30 or 40 minutes. But be aware, what I'm really trying to do today is just make folks aware of what is in the law, what's required in the law, the way the council has gone about its business, and to give an overview of the recommendations so that those of you who do wish to review the draft plan and provide comments can think about where to focus your efforts. But before we get started, I think that to understand the significance of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, we need to understand the global context. Probably everyone on this call recognizes that there is a dangerous gap between our international ambition to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the level of reductions that are actually necessary, will be necessary to avoid dangerous levels of warming. The nations of the world have agreed in principle to limit warming to less than 1.5 degrees centigrade, but we have already baked into our Earth system a significant amount of climate change, and current policies and targets will allow warming to exceed not only 1.5 degrees centigrade, we're already at 1.1 degrees centigrade warming, but probably would exceed 2 degrees centigrade. In fact, national policies that are currently in place, even if they are fully enacted, would likely allow 2.7 degrees centigrade warming by the end of the century, and possibly as much as 3.6 degrees centigrade. At that level of warming, significant portions of the currently inhabited world would become uninhabitable. Although New York State's greenhouse gas emissions represent only about 0.5 to 1% of the total global emissions, our per capita emissions are several times greater than those of all but a very few of the other inhabitants of the Earth, including those of China. So it's important for us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for the long-term benefit of our children and grandchildren, but also to recognize, particularly those of you who are planners, that we will be dealing with substantial climatic change and its effects, regardless of what we do now to reduce emissions. We are going to be required to make investments to reduce emissions while simultaneously preparing for the effects of climate change. We've already delayed meaningful action far too long, and the longer we procrastinate, the more we will feel the effects of a rapidly warming climate, and the more expensive, the more draconian, and the more likely to fail the necessary greenhouse gas mitigation measures will be. As Sam alluded to, New York State enacted the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in 2019, and it went into effect on January 1st of 2020. And that date is important. Because we are taking comment on a draft plan, but that draft scoping plan addresses only certain aspects of the requirements of the CLCPA. Other aspects that I'll describe actually went into effect again on January 1st of 2020. Overall, the statute sets achievement of a net zero economy by 2050 as a goal, requiring an 85% reduction in New York State's greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, while allowing for sequestration of up to 15% of the state's emissions. The statute sets an interim greenhouse gas emission limit of no more than 60% of 1990 levels, that is a 40% reduction by 2030, and it requires DEC to promulgate a regulation to set those 60% and 15% greenhouse gas emission limits. The Climate Act does not detail an emissions reduction plan, but it does envision an overall strategy of beneficial electrification of the entire New York State economy, empowering that efficient electrified economy with clean sources of power, including 70% renewable electricity by 2030. And I want to stress that that's 70% of the electricity that is sold in New York State, whether it is generated from outside the state or inside the state, must come from renewable sources, wind, water, and solar. By 2040, 100% of the electricity sold in New York State must be sourced from zero carbon sources. And generally that means wind, water, and solar, but also in New York State, nuclear is considered zero carbon. In support of this strategy, the law requires the Public Service Commission to undertake proceedings to ensure large investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency. So when the critics say, where's all this power going to come from? It is coming from investments that are being now in offshore wind, distributed solar, and utility scale solar. The CLCPA further requires that investments in disadvantaged communities be prioritized by the Climate Action Council, and that support be provided to individuals and communities that are currently dependent on fossil fuel industries, so they are not left behind as we move from a fossil fuel-based economy to a clean energy economy. The statute charges DEC as being the primary regulator in limiting greenhouse gas emissions, although other agencies may also issue regulations in support of achievement of the greenhouse gas emission limits, with the CLCPA as their authority to do so. Agency regulations, particularly those at DEC, are to be guided by a scoping plan, which in turn is to be developed by the Climate Action Council. The scoping plan must also be reflected in the first state energy plan issued after completion of the scoping plan. And I believe that state energy plan, next state energy plan, will be due in 2025. So the scoping plan will lay out the high level strategies, if you will, for how to achieve the required emission reductions, while the energy plan and subsequent planning documents would fill in more and more of the detail. The Climate Action Council, again, which is responsible for developing the draft scoping plan, comprises 22 appointees, with the president of NYSERDA and the commissioner of DEC serving as the co-chairs. Pursuant to the statute, the council appointed 7 advisory panels to make recommendations for greenhouse gas reductions in each of 7 major emission sectors, and those recommendations make up the bulk of the draft scoping plan, and we'll get into describing that in a few moments. All the recommendations that have been approved by the council are now embodied in this draft scoping plan, which the council released for public comment on December 30th of 2021. As I mentioned, the statute has a heavy emphasis on climate and environmental justice and requires the Climate Justice Working Group to establish criteria by which disadvantaged communities are to be identified. The Climate Justice Working Group has released those draft criteria and supporting maps, and they are out for public comment as well. That the Climate Justice Working Group will be accepting comment on those draft criteria and maps through July 7th, 2022. The Climate Justice Working Group has scheduled, I believe it's 11 public hearings on the draft criteria. So at the same time that we are taking comment on the draft scoping plan and have completed 11 public hearings on the draft scoping plan, there is a concurrent public comment period on the criteria by which disadvantaged communities will be defined. The council is required to prioritize benefits to these disadvantaged communities in its planning, and it must identify measures to reduce emissions of co-pollutants in disadvantaged communities. At least 35%, with a goal of 40% of the benefits of the state's clean energy investments are required to accrue to these disadvantaged communities. And I saw some information someone put out that said that municipalities would be subject to this requirement. That is not the case. This requirement of at least 35% of clean energy investments going to disadvantaged communities applies to state investments, not to municipal programs and so forth. As DEC develops its regulations to implement the council's recommendations, It is required, DEC is required to ensure that disadvantaged communities are not subjected to any disproportionate burden of those regulations, and DEC must prepare and implement a strategy to monitor and reduce emissions of co-pollutants in disadvantaged communities, and that work is ongoing. An often overlooked but important part of the CLCPA is its Section 7. Section 7 requires all state agencies to reduce their operational emissions, to lead by example, but more significantly, Section 7 requires all state agencies, not just DEC, but all state agencies, in considering any action, whether it's issuing a permit, establishing a funding program, issuing a license of some sort, supporting a project. In any case, they must determine the consistency of that action with the greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements in the statute. And I mentioned that this is important because DEC has already used this requirement to analyze consistency as the basis for denying 2 permits to repower existing power plants. These denials are now the subject of both administrative appeals, and at least one of them is in court. So we will see how those appeals and denials hold up. But these serve as an example of the way DEC and other agencies may use this requirement for consistency with the greenhouse gas emission reduction limits in its permitting and other decisions. Although public focus has largely been on the greenhouse gas reduction requirements of the Climate Act, CLCPA Section 9 did make significant amendments to the Community Risk and Resiliency Act, which is a law that dates back to 2014. As amended, the Community Risk and Resiliency Act now requires consideration of all climate change effects during DEC's review of applications for all major permits and almost all of DEC's regulatory programs. And for the first time, these amendments give DEC explicit authority to require mitigation of significant climate risk to virtually any asset that's not actually owned by the applicant. So any natural resource, adjacent population, public infrastructure. If that project will create a risk under future conditions, DEC now has authority to require mitigation of that future physical risk, future physical climatic risk. Under the law, the council's final scoping plan, so the council has released its draft scoping plan. The final scoping plan is due before January 1st of 2023. That is by the end of this year. And DEC must promulgate regulations to achieve the required emission reductions as guided by the scoping plan 1 year later, that is by 2024. So this is a very aggressive schedule. For any of you who ever had been a party to any of DEC's rulemakings, even relatively simple rulemakings can take 2 or 3 years to be finalized. So this will be a very complex set of regulations. We are already preparing by trying to bring on staff who will be to serve as the rulemakers. But obviously this will be very controversial. So we are looking forward to a very busy coming 18 months as we try to meet this requirement. And we have been given no dispensation. We got a slow start due to COVID, but neither the legislature nor the governor nor our own agency leadership has given us any dispensation regarding the meeting the original statutory deadlines to, again, have that final scoping plan by the end of this year and the regulations 1 year later. The Climate Action Council first met in March of 2020, and later that year, after the advisory panels had been formally impaneled, those advisory panels began to meet to develop their own recommendations, including extensive public consultation. That type of consultation varied, but all of the council meetings, as well as virtually, if not all of the advisory panel meetings, were open to the public to be viewed. If there was not active participation allowed by stakeholders, all the advisory panels did provide opportunity for stakeholders to provide input to their to their process as they develop the sector-specific recommendations. The Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel, to which I had been appointed, for instance, held several roundtables with local government officials to get input on our recommendations. Through the spring and early summer, the advisory panels began to present of 2021, the advisory panels began to present their recommendations to the council, and all these, again, all these meetings have been recorded, and these presentations are available at climate.ny.gov if you would like to hear the way some of the recommendations were presented by the advisory panels. As I mentioned, the council released its draft scoping plan on December 30th of 2021, and the public comment period officially opened on January 1st of 2022. In parallel to supporting the council's process, and in addition to supporting the council and agency staff, I'm sorry, I completely messed up that sentence. In addition to developing the draft scoping plan, the council and the agencies have completed several other required milestones from the statute, including the fact that the Public Service Commission has adopted an updated clean energy standard that will require that 70% of our electricity by 2030 come from renewable sources. DEC and NYSERDA were required to issue a report on barriers to clean energy and adaptation resources and opportunities to overcome those barriers in disadvantaged communities. And we released that report in December 2021. That's also available at climate.ny.gov. And I mentioned that DEC is required to promulgate regulations setting those 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas emission limits. And we have done that, as well as issuing guidance on the use of the social cost of carbon, all of which are required by the law. So we are on schedule for all, have been on schedule for all the milestones required by the Act to date. Also, as required by the Climate Act, DEC issued a greenhouse gas emissions report, a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, if you will, at the end of 2021. So responsibility for issuing the state's greenhouse gas report was shifted by the law from NYSERDA to DEC. And based on this report, we can see the enormity of the challenge that New York State faces, as illustrated by the bar graph on the right. We're going to be required by the law to reduce the state's greenhouse gas emissions from about 375 million metric tons to about 61 million metric tons over the next 30 years or so. The inner ring of the circular graph indicates the relative proportions represented by our major emission sectors, and the outer ring shows the contribution of individual sources within each of those sectors. We show this because understanding the current sources of our emissions can help us understand better the selection of strategies that are included in the draft scoping plan. I'll mention that although many people tend to think of power plants as the major cause of climate change, in New York State, they represent only about 13% of our total emissions profile. In New York State, our bigger sources are the transportation sector at 28% and our buildings at 32% of our total emissions. So again, transportation at 28% and buildings at 32%. And that 32% of our emissions that come from buildings does not include the electricity that's used within those buildings. That electricity, the emissions associated with the building, electricity use are included in that 13% of emissions attributable to the power sector. When we talk about building emissions, we're really talking about emissions that are primarily the result of combustion of fossil fuels to heat space and water, for drying clothes, and for cooking, and also hydrofluorocarbons, which are a very powerful greenhouse gas that are released from building equipment and from foam insulation. Waste management, which includes methane emissions from landfills and wastewater treatment plants, comes in at about 12%. So it's responsible for almost as much greenhouse gas emissions as power generation in New York State. Agriculture in New York State is important, but relatively small portion of our total profile, coming in at about 6%. So understanding that should give you some idea of why some of the strategies were chosen that are in the plan were chosen. The council's planning has been informed by analysis performed at NYSERDA and with numerous consultants to integrate all of the advisory panel recommendations to assess their likely total effects on greenhouse gas emissions, as well as overall costs and benefits as required by the law. This analysis included a reference case based on business as usual, plus greenhouse gas reduction policies that were already in place. And I don't show, that is not the graph that's shown here. That analysis showed that current policies, even though New York State is already considered a leader in terms of greenhouse gas mitigation, our current policies would not bring us close to achieving the required emission reductions. The analysis also included a scenario that was labeled Scenario 1, and that included all of the recommendations as presented by those 7 advisory panels. However, that analysis indicated that putting all those advisory panel recommendations together at the level of ambition that was envisioned by the panels, even that was not sufficient to achieve the required emission reductions, so would not be compliant with the law. So we're not even showing Scenario 1 here. What we are showing are the 3 action scenarios that were ultimately developed and adopted by the council. Having determined that the advisory panel recommendations, again, as presented, would not achieve the required emission reductions, the council went back to the drawing board and developed these 3 action scenarios that we depict here, scenarios 2, 3, and 4. All of these scenarios would be expected to achieve the required reductions, but they do not represent a specific plan or recommendation. They are, as scenarios are often used, intended to show the range of options that are available to decision makers and some of the specifics on which the council is inviting stakeholder comment now. So I'm not going to get into describing all the detail in this very busy figure. It is available. I'm certainly happy to make these slides available, but many of these slides, including this very detailed one, are available at climate.ny.gov. This figure does represent a comparison among those 3 action scenarios, 2, 3, and 4, as presented in the draft scoping plan. What I will talk, and I won't, again, I'm not going to go into the detail, but I will describe that all 3 action scenarios include in common certain foundational strategies in the power generation, transportation, agriculture, and waste sectors. And if you think about what I said about where our emissions come from, you got to focus your strategies on the largest sources of emissions. And so that's what the draft scoping plan does. And it has become obvious from the integration analysis that we would not be able to meet our emission reduction requirements without focusing on those big sectors. And so there, if you look across those 3 action scenarios, they're in many ways very similar in that all have a heavy emphasis on rapid electrification and gains in energy efficiency that must be included in any scenario if we are to achieve the required emission reductions. These 3 scenarios, however, do provide for different approaches to reducing emissions from some sources. All scenarios include zero emissions electricity generation by 2040 as required by the law, but also full electrification of buildings and transportation, aggressive action to reduce vehicle miles traveled, a transition to low global warming potential refrigerants, and elimination of fugitive methane emissions. And as most of you are probably aware, there's a big focus on methane because it is a very powerful greenhouse gas emission, greenhouse gas itself, but relatively short-lived. And so by making rapid reductions in methane emissions, we can achieve substantial impact on climate. In general, the 3 action scenarios differ somewhat in the use of low carbon fuels that would be derived from biomass or the use of green hydrogen in some of the scenarios versus an accelerated transition away from all combustion including combustion of non-fossil fuels, of low carbon biofuels. And there are differences in the pace with which some policies are implemented, particularly those that are focused on reduction of vehicle miles traveled and methane emissions. Looking at just a little more detail, scenarios 2 and 3 differ in that scenario 2 includes use of low carbon fuels derived from biomass and green hydrogen, especially in applications that would be difficult to electrify, while scenario 3 includes an accelerated transition away from all combustion with more aggressive building and transportation electrification than would be assumed in scenario 2. Of course, that more aggressive electrification would raise cost and logistical concerns. Scenario 4 would include more limited use of low carbon fuels while accelerating implementation of policies that are intended to drive electrification, again, to reduce VMT and more rapid reduction of methane emissions. Among the most important findings of the integration analysis was that the level of required decarbonization required to comply with the greenhouse gas emission limits in the law is feasible, but it will require aggressive action and investment across all emitting sectors. So we have no time to waste. Necessary strategies include deep improvements in energy efficiency across all sectors, but again, particularly in our buildings. The transition to electrification for heating water and space would be implemented primarily through the use of high efficiency heat pumps. We're not talking about heat pumps from 30 years ago. We're talking about heat pumps that are effective at temperatures substantially below 0 degrees Celsius. These modern heat pumps are capable of heating homes at temperatures, as I say, well below 0, and are much more efficient than old style resistance heating. Heating water and space with heat pumps will also result in significantly improved indoor air quality. Despite numerous false claims, neither the draft scoping plan nor any state entity has proposed banning home heating with wood. Somehow this rumor got started and it's simply not true. To help achieve climate justice and to conserve land, the plan calls for enhanced mass transit, true smart growth, and other strategies to reduce miles traveled in passenger cars and trucks. All 3 action scenarios include electrification of light-duty vehicles, and the governor has already signed legislation, getting ahead of the Climate Action Council, if you will. That legislation that would ban the sale of gas and diesel-powered cars and trucks by 2035. The plan includes strategies to eliminate high global warming potential refrigerants, as well as fugitive methane emissions across the waste, ag, and energy sectors, while maximizing carbon sequestration in New York's lands and forests through land conservation and improved soil and forest management. And it includes strategies to develop the diverse portfolio of actions that will be necessary to improve energy efficiency. I think I jumped there a little bit. Low carbon fuels, such as biomass or green hydrogen, will likely be necessary in those hard to electrify sectors, such as aviation, heavy duty vehicles, or high temperature industrial processes. But I should note that some stakeholders oppose reliance on combustion of low carbon fuels, primarily due to the effects they have on local air quality. And this has turned out to be one of the more contentious issues within the Climate Action Council and between stakeholder groups. With regard to electricity demand, as we replace our fossil fuel heating systems with heat pumps, New York State's electrical power demand will transition from a summer peaking system to a winter peaking system, and total electricity demand will grow by 65 to 85% by 2050. Again, the reason why there is so much investment now in developing not only additional renewable generation capacity, but transmission and distribution capacity as well. The draft scoping plan includes strategies to incorporate statewide load flexibility and controllability into the grid to create a more manageable system. And it's thought that these strategies, plus new and upgraded transmission and distribution systems, will serve to ensure and enhance grid reliability and resilience to extreme weather. In addition, bioenergy or green hydrogen, in addition to battery storage, will likely be necessary to ensure grid reliability as our electrical consumption increases. The Climate Act allows us to count sequestration of up to 15% of our emissions toward achievement of our net zero goal. However, achieving this level of additional sequestration will be difficult because New York State is already so heavily forested. So we may be required to reduce emissions by more than 85% to achieve our net zero goal. And doing this would likely require reliance on technologies such as carbon capture and sequestration. The draft scoping plan includes strategies to reduce emissions from 6 major emission sectors: transportation, power generation, industry, agriculture and forestry, waste, and of course, buildings. It also includes recommended cross-sector policies for land use, local government, clean energy, and adaptation and resilience. And I'll just hit on some of the themes from those sectors. The council's vision for the building sector, because it is so important, includes full electrification of 85% of homes and commercial buildings by 2050. Includes a phased and just transition to a clean energy system, elimination of fossil fuel subsidies, and establishment of energy efficient, zero emissions buildings as the most effective cost option. Overall, the strategies recommended for the building sector follow the same overall strategy as most of the rest of the plan: deep energy efficiency improvements and a transition away from fossil fuel powered appliances to all electric versions powered with zero emissions electricity. The building sector strategies are organized under 4 themes. The plan recommends building code updates for both new construction and for existing buildings to accelerate adoption of zero emission building systems and improve energy efficiency. Energy benchmarking would be required for some types of buildings to provide energy consumption data to inform decision makers, as would energy efficiency performance standards for large buildings. According to the plan, we will have to electrify 1 to 2 million homes with heat pumps by 2030, and more than half of New York State's 6 million buildings will require building envelope improvements. These improvements will require substantial capital investment, but they will ultimately reduce energy bills, improve comfort, and provide improved passive resilience to power outages. Recommended strategies include adoption of a highly efficient state energy code by 2023 and state support for local code enforcement. Because of the urgency with which we must reduce emissions and significant costs that would come with retrofitting, the transition to full electrification would begin with the elimination of oil and gas for heating, cooking, and drying clothes in new construction by 2024 in single family and low-rise buildings, and by 2027 for new larger buildings. The sale of oil and gas home appliances will be phased out by 2035, but no one would be required to abandon serviceable appliances or home heating systems. Although no one in an existing building would be required to make the transition to all electric systems in one fell swoop, and many all electric systems are less expensive to maintain and operate, many do require significant upfront investment. So the plan recognizes that financial incentives will be necessary to motivate homeowners to electrify building equipment and implement energy efficiency measures, and to enable building decarbonization, particularly in low-income households and disadvantaged communities. Other transportation strategies in the draft scoping plan include encouraging a rapid transition to zero emissions vehicles, as I've mentioned, and non-road equipment, and lowering the carbon content of fossil transportation fuels by promoting blending of renewable fuels and use of cleaner fuels such as green hydrogen, where electrification is difficult. The draft plan includes promotion of transit-oriented development as a critical element of smart growth by making public transportation and low-carbon transportation alternatives more affordable, attractive, accessible, and convenient, and planning infrastructure and development to allow more efficient and sustainable use of the landscape. To support communities in achieving smart growth development patterns, the draft plan includes direct planning assistance in the form of planning grants, technical assistance, and capacity building, and providing the tools and resources necessary for localities to make the best and most informed decisions about where to grow, how to grow, and where not to grow. Importantly, the draft plan also includes steps to be taken to ensure alignment of state funding resources, from economic development to infrastructure to housing and everything in between that influences land use outcomes. The draft scoping plan includes policies to encourage use and promotion of energy efficiency and clean energy by local governments. These policies include development of tools such as the statewide communities dashboard of community greenhouse gas emissions inventories. And also the plan recognizes that most municipalities can benefit from additional technical support. And so it calls for expansion of existing programs such as NYSERDA's Clean Energy Communities Coordinators and DEC's Climate Smart Community Coordinators. And I just want to mention when we come to for local governments, there are very few mandates for local governments in this plan. We recognize, those of us who are in the Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel recognize the existence of home rule in New York State. And so virtually all of the recommendations call for additional support and guidance, but not for unfunded mandates that would affect municipalities. Although waste was not included in the 6 original advisory panels required by the climate law, in recognition of this sector's substantial contribution to the state's greenhouse gas emissions profile, the council did appoint a 7th advisory panel, which is empowered to do by the law, to focus on waste. Strategies included in the waste reduction strategies included in the waste sector include waste reduction, reuse, and recycling to address the full life cycle of materials and products from product creation to beneficial use. The strategies do recognize the combustion and landfilling of some components of the waste stream will continue beyond 2050, but that it tries to include strategies that would reduce the amount that is disposed in landfills, and particularly of organics over time. Other strategies would support this transformation of wastewater treatment plants that currently focus on disposal to water resource recovery facilities with a greater focus on capture of beneficial products, such as biogas and biosolids. The draft plan also includes strategies to reduce emissions from solid waste and water recovery facilities through improved monitoring and engineering and regulatory programs and encouragement of sewering. Additional strategies in this sector would include development of markets for recovered resources, reuse of building materials, strategic use of biogas, and funding for organics recycling infrastructure. And finally, perhaps most of interest to this particular group, I'll mention that in addition to reducing building emissions, the plan does have strategies for how we use our land, as after all, as Mark Twain said, they're not making it anymore. Achieving enough additional soil soil and forest carbon sequestration to offset 15% of our emissions will be difficult, as I mentioned. But the draft plan does include numerous regulatory and investment strategies intended to maximize what we can achieve, including development of a statewide conservation framework, support for improved wetlands protection, which the legislature and the governor have already adopted, and support for more effective local and private forest and soil stewardship. As I mentioned, smart growth is central to the strategies intended to reduce vehicle miles traveled and their associated transportation emissions. Many of the draft scoping plans land use strategies are focused on strengthening the role of regional and county-based land use planning to guide, inform, and incentivize smart, equitable, sustainable land use decisions at regional and municipal levels. In addition to the greenhouse gas mitigation strategies, which were required by the law, the draft scoping plan also includes recommendations related to adaptation and resilience. Now, the law does not require that the draft scoping plan include adaptation and resilience recommendations, but the co-chairs of the Climate Action Council requested that the Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel develop develop adaptation and resilience recommendations. Excuse me. And I was actually put in charge of leading that work group. And so I'll mention just a few. There are more than 60 adaptation and resilience recommendations. I will note, however, that these recommendations are not binding on any agency or other entity, but we are already pursuing implementation of some of those. And I'll just mention a few of the most important ones now. There were 3 themes, as I mentioned. The building capacity theme comprises 4 initiatives related to statewide planning, consideration of future conditions in state decision-making, and identifying options for financing adaptation and reducing or shifting risk. Chief among the Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel's adaptation recommendations within this theme are that the governor appoint a chief state resiliency officer to coordinate the many agencies that have a role to play in adaptation to climate change, and direct that officer to lead development of a comprehensive state adaptation plan, which the state of New York currently lacks. The council developed recommendations under 5 initiatives to help municipalities prepare for and react to increasingly severe climate hazards. These initiatives would include recommendations to expand state support for regional and local adaptation planning and for incorporating future conditions into local planning and regulatory decisions. This would include guidance and information, online decision support tools, and direct technical assistance and funding. The council made specific recommendations to address risk due to flooding through additional floodplain assessments, right-sizing road crossing infrastructure, and strengthening the building code. And the council made recommendations related to our response to extreme heat and green infrastructure planning, which again, the governor has already taken up by directing DEC and NYSERDA to develop an extreme heat action plan, which we are currently focusing on. And finally, the council recommended action to ensure resilience of the energy system, including requirements for utilities and power generators to assess and address their system vulnerabilities to extreme weather. The living systems theme comprises 3 initiatives. The first initiative is focused on addressing risk to our ecosystems and biodiversity and emphasizes the need to ensure conservation and connectivity of critical habitats. Recommendations included in this theme include better wetlands protection and better protection of stream buffers. The panel also provided recommendations specific to the agricultural sector and recommendations to ensure the ability of our forests to continue to serve as carbon sinks. Of course, there will be cost to all this recommended work, but also benefits. And NYSERDA has compared the anticipated economy-wide costs of the 3 action scenarios with the benefits and job creation opportunities of each. And I want to emphasize that the analysis that benefit cost analysis done to date has focused on the level of investment that would be required. It is agnostic as to who would actually be footing the bill. That was the direction to the advisory panels, that the advisory panels not come up with financing strategies, but rather the council is responsible. The Climate Action Council in the final scoping plan will make recommendations for actually financing these initiatives and how that money would be raised. The council has also recommended that additional cost benefit analysis would be performed as individual proposals are advanced that would come with additional implementation details. However, even that the overall cost benefit analysis that was completed indicates that the net direct cost, that is the incremental investment needed to make the transition over the next 30 years, is a relatively small percentage of our state's $1.7 trillion gross state product. comprising less than 1% of the gross state product in 2030, rising to about 1.4% of GSP in 2050. Given the predominance of certain strategies common to all three action scenarios, the costs and benefits are fairly similar across all three of the action scenarios included in the draft scoping plan. When accounting for both the economic impacts of climate change using DEC's social cost of carbon guidance and monetized health benefits, NYSERDA estimates that investments of this small proportion of our GSP, and most of which would go to our buildings and electricity system, would yield net benefits of between 90 and 120 billion dollars between now and 2050. That is, the benefits will exceed the cost by 90 to 120 billion dollars. Now, the assessment does not include job creation or economic development opportunities, but there was a separate job study that projected the overall employment in the energy, buildings, and transportation sectors from 2019 through 2050 will increase by at least 268,000 jobs, representing a 54% increase in the workforce within those sectors. The job study also revealed that New York stands to see 10 jobs added in the clean energy sector for every job that would be potentially displaced. That is, jobs that are in the fossil fuel industry that would be displaced. A large proportion of the net benefits will be in the form of public health and would apply across all action scenarios. And that's simply because as we reduce combustion of fossil fuels to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we also eliminate our largest source of other pollutants that cause and exacerbate a variety of cardiorespiratory illnesses, particularly among the elderly, the poor, urban poor, outside workers, and children. We also anticipate health benefits associated with the efforts to encourage non-motorized transportation. Although the council has released its draft scoping plan, it does have more work to do and is continuing to meet approximately monthly. Upcoming council meetings will include additional discussion of several critical topics, including potential use or abandonment of our current gas infrastructure, and again, the important topic of how this will be financed, including potential carbon pricing. The council has held 11 public hearings on the draft scoping plan. Recordings of those hearings are available at climate.ny.gov. I would encourage you to go to climate.ny.gov if you are of a mind to review either the entire scoping plan or to focus on any of its sector-specific chapters, provide input through June 10th. The current deadline for comments is June 10th. I understand, however, that at its most recent council meeting, the council discussed the potential to potentially give another extension to the public comment period, but we do have to, we have over 20,000 comments that we're going to have to sift through now. So there will be a deadline at some point because staff do need to begin to prepare the final scoping plan, incorporating that input that is coming in now. Written comment can be submitted through an online form that's available at climate.ny.gov, or you can submit comments to scopingplan@nyserda.gov. With that, I will leave my contact information up there for a moment before I stop sharing, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, for providing that overview of where we are as a state. It's a lot of information, a lot of data, but I guess that's what this requires, right? We need to be smart about how we're investing in our economy moving forward in order to reduce our impact on emissions. I was remiss at the beginning in not reminding everyone, those of you who have your AICP, that we are offering CM and SR, and the SR stands for Sustainability and Resilience credits for this presentation. So I believe that this is the first presentation, at least in New York State, to receive the SR credit. So that's a new requirement of AICP. So thank you for those of you who are joining us. We do have a question, Mark, from Patrick Gooch, who asks, how does the plan address the need to build safer bicycle facilities to encourage people to travel via low or no carbon active transportation options like bicycles or e-bikes? And specifically, do we anticipate there will be more funding made available to DOTs at all levels to transform roads into transportation corridors and not automobile corridors?
That is certainly the hope. I would say, and this is a bit of a personal perspective, as a member of the Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel, we're not able to get as detailed as we might have hoped in terms of specific programs. So there are recommendations there that there be additional support and both financial as well as informational support to encourage non-motorized transport. And of course, then we're talking about bicycling and pedestrian. At the time we were developing those recommendations, people were talking about the Federal Infrastructure Act and how that would be used. And I think many of us hope that that infrastructure, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, will in fact provide a mechanism for funding, and that the draft the recommendations in the draft scoping plan will be used in tandem with that available money to develop more specific plans on how we do things other than build roads for cars.
And
but
building,
I would, and so just let me add, you
Sure.
guys are the professional planners. If there are more specific things that you think we should include in the plan, or just for folks like me to have in my mind after I read the comment, please, we really want comments on this. There are, I believe some areas where we were not able to develop, simply didn't have the time to develop as specific plans as we would like. And we were also very cognizant of home rule, which all of you know is a limiting factor in what the state can do. So, let us know how we can work within that home rule to provide better support.
So actually, Mark, that's one question that I have, and then Molly just entered a question of her own, but we'll get to Molly's question in a moment. So I think, oftentimes municipalities, Mark, struggle with the resources to update their zoning, for example. And many times those resources are not available at the state level through the consolidated funding application, for example. I know there was at least one instance where the state through RGGI actually did make funding available for local comprehensive planning and zoning. Is that something that you anticipate the state doing in the future in order to provide some additional incentive for local municipalities to implement things like transit-oriented development?
I hope so. Now, I will say that we do, through our Climate Smart Communities program, provide funding to support updates to comprehensive plans, and where communities don't have comp plans to actually develop them. There's some requirements about elements of sustainability that must be included in those comprehensive plans, but there is some funding available, and there's actually more available this year than there ever has been by $1 million. So, the CFA, it's in the CFA, so it's there. But I do think, that there is recognition that more is needed, and more is needed to encourage regional and county level planning, because we're not going to get where we need to be with every municipality working on its own. And Paul Byer, our friend of Paul Byer Department of State, has been able to do some county level smart growth funds, some county level smart growth plans, and I think that it's recognized that that should be expanded. But the law didn't come with any money with it, so all we can do is recommend that be there.
So, Mark, thank you. Molly asks that you mentioned a lot of support for and funding for homeowners to invest in clean energy, electric and heating sources. Has any thought been given to similar programs for landlords and developers of rental housing?
Yes, it's recognized that owners of multi-unit buildings will need financial support as well. And that's something that's really handled by NYSERDA, not by my office. So not familiar with what programs may already be available or the specifics, but certainly from the presentations I've heard from those folks, it is recognized that commercial building owners will also need support. But again, it's down to the council to make recommendations on where that level of funding might come from. Because for a lot of these programs, there's already some limited funding available, whether it's for a homeowner to have heat pumps installed or to drive an electric vehicle. There are state incentives already available, but ramping those up, bringing up both the total amount available as well as the amount that's available to an individual. So, I drive an electric vehicle and I took advantage of a state incentive, but probably someone who is, less fortunate, less privileged than I am is going to need a larger individual incentive. And so that has all been recognized.
There's one last question, Mark, and for everyone that's with us today, Mark has indicated he could stay for a few more minutes if we do have additional questions. So if anyone has a question that you're dying to ask, please let us know. But Erica has asked Mark if the scoping report addresses the topic of local food systems and realizing that agriculture as a sector perhaps isn't a large contributor to GHGs, but the transportation of food, for example, across the country to feed us all does contribute to the transportation sector. So right. Is there any thought given to that?
I can't say that I'm all that familiar with the agriculture recommendations. There are a lot of them, a lot of agricultural recommendations, and I think many of those are premised on ensuring that our agricultural community remains vibrant and productive. And so I would say in general, yes, but I can't talk about the specifics. A large number of those agricultural recommendations are focused on helping the agricultural community become more energy efficient and to reduce its reliance on fossil fuels. There will also have to be recommendations about fertilizer application, being more efficient, but all those are things that can reduce operating costs for the farmer. And so again, helping them stay in business here in the state.
So as a regional planner, I'm going to use my privilege as the webinar host here, Mark Castiglione, Upstate APA chapter president, to ask Mark a question and maybe to provide, a supporting comment of your work as you move forward, thinking about implementation. So we have the struggle between home rule and coordination that we always have to deal with when we're talking about implementation. When we talk about regional or county level plans, that's good as a forum to articulate consensus and shared goals, which is important. But we also have to consider where the rubber meets the road is, zoning ordinances, building codes, subdivision regulations, all those things that happen at the local level. And in my experience, given the limited local capacity, if there's just some simple template that comes with money, like, hey, municipality, you need to do X, Y, Z, and we'll give you all this money to do that. So some sort of carrot and stick approach to really reinforce the regional or shared goals or even state goals, but making sure those things get right down into the nitty-gritty of those building codes and zoning regulations and those things. So that would be my critical suggestion in making sure that all these policies really get implemented at the local level.
I agree 100%, and you'll see that there are recommendations. They'll probably read pretty generally to develop guidance, and that is something that I wish we have had the staff to do. And we probably need to, now I'm not talking about the scoping plan as much, but the way our agency operates is reach out to consulting firms and use some of the now Sam is smiling. Use some of the allocations we've been given to support adaptation, recognizing that our staff time is very limited, and use some outside sources to develop guidance that would be useful. Those and by guidance I mean templates and so forth. And the more specific, Mark, that you can be in terms of what would be useful to the municipalities, the more helpful that is to us in getting the right products out.
Right. Well, I think working with my regional planning commission hat on, you're already getting there, because we're deploying our climate smart program, and really the hand holding that is needed to walk these communities through the process is critical. And whether that happens at a regional planning board or consultant led or county led, that hand holding is critical. I'd just like to take a moment also to thank Sam Gordon for suggesting that Upstate APA host this webinar. We're a critical audience to hear this information, and hopefully collectively we can be a part of the change that's needed, that's envisioned in the scoping document.
Well, thank you, Mark. And I want to thank everybody for participating today. This has been a great session, and we look forward to seeing the next steps, Mark Lowry, as the state moves forward with implementing the CLCPA.
Very good. Well, get your comments in. Be as specific as possible.
Great.
Thank you
Take
very
care,
much.
everyone.